Hello, and welcome to the TexMix, brought to you by the Texas Signal. I'm your host, Jessica Montoya Coggins, and today we are talking immigration. And I'm so delighted to be joined by someone who I've known a couple of years now and who's a friend, Juan Carlos Cerda.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Jessica.
Oh, it's great to talk with you. So now, Juan Carlos, you are the Deputy Campaign Director for the American Business and Immigration Coalition, as well as the State Director for the Texas Business and Immigration Coalition. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and these organizations that you work with?
Absolutely happy to. And I know my story might be a little long, but I'll try to keep it succinct.
We know the longer the better. Tell us everything.
Definitely. So I'm an immigrant myself, and I'm also a DACA recipient. I came to the US when I was 7 years old with my family for a better life and for better economic opportunities. And both my parents are undocumented. My dad is a electrician and my mother is a factory worker. My grandfather was actually a migrant farm worker picking fruits and vegetables in the 1960s. So we go a long way back with the US. But we were undocumented and we came because a lot of our family members were already here. So we knew that the US was a land of opportunity. And this was not something that was hidden from me. I grew up knowing that I was undocumented and knowing that it would create challenges in my life. So I grew up in Dallas, not far from Pleasant Grove, and I ended up moving to Grand Prairie. I love school, love learning, and even though my immigration status was a barrier to me, I still thought that I could still do what I love and still study and work hard and try to achieve my dreams. So I ended up being salutatorian for my high school. I went to Grand Prairie High School, and a lot of my teachers, they heard my story. I confided in them. I told them that I was undocumented, and they wouldn't take that as a barrier to completing my dream. So they did everything to help me out and get me to where I wanted to go. I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to attend Yale University. And even while undocumented, it was still a big struggle because I remember the first thing I did when I was admitted to Yale, I went to the Mexican consulate in Dallas to get a passport so that I can actually fly to Connecticut and not get deported in the process. So this was before DACA. And honestly, if it hadn't been for so many undocumented students pressuring Congress and asking President Obama to enact immigration reform, without them doing that, there would have been no DACA. So I really owe it to them. And I think about this process that we had to undergo, this advocacy we had to do to get to where we are today. So, long story short, I ended up getting DACA in 2012. It completely changed my life. It got me my first legal job, my driver's license, and the chance to leave the country for the first time in 14 years to go study abroad in the United Kingdom. And when I came back and graduated from college, I was able to become a kindergarten teacher with the Teach for America program in Pleasant Grove, not far from where I grew up. So honestly, I probably would still be in the classroom if it weren't for my immigration status, which, as you know, every 2 years I have to renew my DACA work permit. But at the time, this was in 2016, my work permit was submitted about 5 months in advance, which is it's usually a lot of time for an application, but it was delayed at the time because immigration made a mistake. There was some kind of computer glitch that caused this delay, and my work permit was not renewed on time. And Dallas ISD unfortunately informed me that I couldn't be legally working on campus and that I couldn't even volunteer with my own kindergarten students in my classroom. So that was a really heavy experience. This was right in the middle of the 2016 presidential election when President Trump rose to become president. I was undocumented, unemployed, and I was fearful for my future because I knew that President Trump had campaigned on getting rid of DACA and being harder on immigrants. So I was able to get help from my Congresswoman, Eddie Bernice Johnson, who wrote a letter on my behalf and asked USCIS and immigration to get my work permit approved. So I was able to get my job back. But when I came back to teach, I could see the fear in my parents and my students' parents, and I could see the difference that one president to another had on immigrants. And then a couple of months later, I hear that Texas was going to pass a really tough law that you probably heard about called SB4. It's known as the Show Me Your Papers law, similar to the one they passed in Arizona back in 2010, that I was afraid was going to get my parents and myself deported. So I knew that being in the classroom, I only had so much influence over something like this Show Me Your Papers law. And I really wanted to be involved full time in immigration advocacy, not only because of President Trump uh, promising to end DACA, but also because of Texas trying to basically deport immigrants and ask them for their immigration status. So I decided to leave the classroom and joined a progressive organization that you've also heard about called the Texas Organizing Project to do immigration advocacy in the summer of 2017. And I was only there for a month when President Trump actually did end the DACA program. And at that point, I knew that it wasn't just to try to protect my parents and my family from getting asked for their immigration status, but literally protecting my ability to work in this country. So I ended up being an advocate for a solution to DACA. I was invited to speak in front of more than 90 business leaders in Dallas with the mayor at the time, Mike Rawlings. And that's how I first got to know my employer, the American Business Immigration Coalition. So after working on the 2018 elections, getting many progressive candidates elected to office in the 2018 midterms, I was invited to work for APIC as the Dallas Fort Worth director and now the Texas chapter director. So that's what we've been doing for the past 3 years now, is engaging the business community on common sense immigration solutions and on basically these bipartisan solutions to grow our economy, keep families together, and create jobs.
I've heard your story before, but just sort of processing this again, it is so heartbreaking to me. I'm the granddaughter of a teacher, and I know that she was over at Thomas Jefferson up here in North Texas. But she worked with a lot of ESL students, and there were many immigrants at that time, especially in the 90s when she was teaching. And I just think that it is just appalling that, we have someone like yourself and all of the thousands of DACA recipients throughout the country, or people who haven't even applied to DACA, which, by the way, could you sort of let us, because I know that a lot of these glitches kind of tend to happen and it's not necessarily the easiest process. Could you tell us a little bit about how it actually is supposed to work and why there have been some delays here?
Yeah, absolutely. So DACA was enacted by President Obama in 2012 as a temporary measure. It's an executive program that basically protects adults who were brought to the US as children from deportation, and that gives them the ability to work and to study in the meantime. So because of it is a temporary program, it requires individuals to apply every 2 years, pay a $465 fee, and also to go through background checks. So there's a lot of requirements, and there is a cutoff date. You had to have come to the US before 2007, and that definitely leaves out many individuals who came when they were children. I mentor a student who went to a Townview Magnet High School in Dallas, who came in 2010, and he was 8 years old when he came to the US. He's now a student at the University of Houston, and he's undocumented. He doesn't have DACA, so it is an arbitrary date. And now there's more than 600,000 individuals across the country, including over 265,000 here in Texas who have or are eligible for DACA, can qualify for it. And now we know that a federal judge in Houston ruled that DACA is unconstitutional. He didn't decide to completely end the program, but right now, even young individuals who weren't old enough to apply for DACA, they're not able to apply for DACA now because it's technically unconstitutional. So they've kind of been left out in the wind, unable to get legal work authorization and unsecured unsure about their future.
I'm so glad you brought this up. We've talked about DACA before on the TexMix, but a lot has happened in these past couple of months. I should remind folks that our Attorney General, Ken Paxton, uh, in, indicted on felony securities fraud, currently under investigation by the FBI for abuse of office and bribery. That's a separate incident, by the way. But anyway, so Paxton led a charge of states, wanting to overturn DACA, and a judge in Texas, Andrew Hannon, did rule, against this. And my understanding is, even, now with that there was even about 80,000 recipients that could have potentially gotten DACA, if not now for it being halted for the new renewals even.
That's right. So in Texas, about 18,000 young high schoolers graduate from Texas high schools every year. And a lot of them came after 2007, which is the cutoff date for DACA. So there was a study nationally showing that uh, right now there's only 600,000 DACA recipients across the country, but potentially the population of dreamers who could qualify for legal status or who could potentially get DACA is somewhere in the number of 1.8 million. So if you get a sense of that, the DACA recipient population is just a small segment of the large dreamer population of individuals who have been studying in school, would like to serve in the military but can't because of restrictions, and who, for all intents and purposes, are American and are not recognized as such by the US.
Right. And so the Biden administration has appealed this ruling from Texas against DACA. And I know that there's also a case that MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, has filed as well. But there is, I know, a glimmer of hope when it comes to immigration reform. And it is in a very complicated thing called the Budget Reconciliation Bill. So just a few days ago, the House Judiciary Committee in the U.S. Congress, they passed a portion of this reconciliation bill, which is, I think, just one of those big Washington, D.C. words that we hear a lot. But there are provisions in this bill that include immigration reform. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because it does sound a little complicated.
Yes, it is it does sound a little complicated, and basically what it boils down to is whether providing a path to earn citizenship for undocumented immigrants will impact the federal budget. And we, as a coalition, prefer bipartisanship, but we've had over 41 meetings with Republican senators and 47 in-person public events with both Democratic and Republican lawmakers, and not a single Republican senator has co-sponsored bipartisan legislation like the DREAM Act, which would give a path to citizenship for dreamers, or legislation like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which would give legal status to farm workers who provide food for all of Americans. Not a single one has co-sponsored that legislation. So we believe that immigration is urgent and that it does belong in budget reconciliation because it does create jobs, it allows immigrants to pay more taxes, and ultimately it will grow the economy. So there was a study by economists that showed that if you give a pathway to legal status for essential workers, farm workers, and dreamers and TPS recipients, the US economy would gain $1.5 trillion over the next decade in GDP, and all Americans would get $600 in increased wages, and 400,000 jobs would be created. So this legislation would basically earn legal status for this category of workers that are in essential industries in various sectors. And the reason why I say earned is because you have to pass background checks. If you're a dreamer, you have to be studying, you have to be in school, you have to be willing to serve in the military and be working full time. And if you're a TPS recipient, you have to be in the country because of a natural disaster or a civil war in your country of origin. So really, there are tough requirements to qualify for this legislation, and it makes economic sense. The question is whether immigration, as proposed by the Congress, can actually pass something called muster, which is something very esoteric sounding, but basically the Senate parliamentarian, who is an expert on these issues, has to determine whether immigration does indeed impact the federal budget, which we argue it can. And we should be hearing in the next few days whether immigration can be included in this budget reconciliation bill.
Mm-hmm. And U.S. Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, who is the chair of the committee that was working on this reconciliation bill, she is hopeful, I think, that the Senate parliamentarian will rule that way. And I believe there has been, instances in the past where immigration reform has been included in this reconciliation bill. But one of the things that I really noticed when, members of Congress have been speaking about this is they've really been, again, touting your points about the economy, the 1.5 trillion that will be gained in the GDP. And we're coming, right now, we're still in the middle of a global pandemic, in addition to, the loss of life, the really tragic there. The economy has very much suffered in many sectors around the country. And I can't think of a way that would, get us back on track than exactly this. Has that been something that y'all have been hearing from? Because I know that you have a large coalition of businesses that you work with. Is that something that you're also hearing from them?
Absolutely. We're a coalition of more than 1,200 CEOs across 16 states. And some of our coalition members are big Democratic and Republican donors, including Carol Siegel, the founder of Crate and Barrel, Woody Hunt, the senior chairman of Hunt Companies, and John Rowe, the former chairman of Exelon Corporation. So the feedback we're getting from our members is that immigrants are essential for their industries. I mean, there's more than 500,000 dreamers, for example, who work in essential sectors. Many of them are nurses, they're frontline pandemic responders. We really need these immigrant workers at a time when there's severe labor shortages across various sectors. And there is precedence for including immigration in budget reconciliation. So in 2005, there was a situation in which Senate Republicans actually supported and voted in favor of including 3.2 million green cards in budget reconciliation. And many of these Republican senators, including one of our own, Senator John Cornyn. So we argued that if they're able to vote in favor of providing green cards for immigrants back then Democrats should also be able to do that with this budget reconciliation, which could include up to 7 million immigrants.
Mm-hmm. And, I keep thinking back to, when President Obama created DACA, it was really in response to the fact that the DREAM Act did not pass the U.S. Congress. So it passed the Senate, but then Speaker John Boehner just never brought it up for a vote. And I know you've mentioned currently no Republicans are sponsoring that legislation, but I believe at the time that there were at least a couple senators that were. So I guess when, and a lot of the business leaders you mentioned are Republican, what do you think if they had a chance to really talk with these Republican senators who don't want this legislation, what do you imagine that their conversation would be like?
Their conversation is that immigration is a no-brainer. If you just look at the state of Texas, we have over 1.7 million undocumented immigrants, and they are basically paying $4 billion in local, state, and federal taxes and wielding a spending power of $31.8 billion. So it makes economic sense to integrate these undocumented immigrants into our economy and provide them a path to earn legal status. But the problem is that a lot of these lawmakers, they either don't understand, don't care about, or are afraid about these economic facts. And we know that we have to talk with the facts, because otherwise misinformation about immigration is something that lawmakers will use in their attempt to get reelected. We know that immigration is a political football, and that it's really up to lawmakers to really hear the facts from constituents and do what's best for the economy, because we argue that immigration will create jobs, it will keep families together, and it will grow the economy. I mean, it's morally right, it's economically smart, and it's politically important, and it should be a no-brainer. But the problem is politics and the next re-election cycle, which is why we continue to say that we've given many chances for bipartisanship, but no Republican is taking a lead on this because they're not following the facts. So including immigration in reconciliation is really the only viable option for now until the 2022 midterms. And we have to do everything we can to make the economic case and to continue pushing, because that's the only way you're able to get big policy changes, is through political advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also do want to point out for folks that the last time there was major immigration reform in this country, it was under Ronald Reagan, who last I checked was a Republican. But you did mention misinformation, and I think that's something that we see especially come through when it comes to immigration reform. So I'm glad that you talked about the stipulations that are required for DACA, because one thing you'll hear is, oh, these are criminals we don't, gang members that are coming through with this. What are some other misconceptions that you encounter, trying to get immigration reform passed?
We hear so many misconceptions. I mean, one of them is that immigrants don't work and that they get federal benefits. But the truth is that immigrants come here to work, and you can look at my family story as an example. My grandfather coming to the US to pick fruits and vegetables as a migrant farm worker. My dad being a veteran electrician who, right now, if he had legal status, he could get a master's electrician license and go to the next level in terms of his career level. And my mother being a factory worker, and also a mother who took care of her children, saw them succeed in school, and if she were able to get legal status, she can do so much more with that. So my immigrants come here to work. When you give people an opportunity to advance in life, to have access to education, to be able to advance in their career, they're able to do so much more, just because many of us come from countries where there's not much economic opportunity, or perhaps there's civil war or natural disasters. And we come to the US with this mentality that we want something better, and that we're going to work for our families, provide for them, and that we're also going to be part of the community because we came here seeking a better life. So that's one of them. And the other misconception is that immigrants are basically there, that the immigration system is easy, and that you should be able to get in line to be able to get a green card. Unfortunately, the reality is that the immigration system is very complicated, and it's not merit-based. It's based on family connections. So you have to have a US citizen spouse or a US citizen parent, and you have to be basically either married to that US citizen spouse or be under 18 to qualify for a green card. So via that route, I mean, it's basically a lottery depending on who you were born to. And if you're coming here to the country for work, it's also a burden on employers. Employers have to pay thousands of dollars to bring any employee they want from abroad. They have to basically publicize that they need workers first, and those expenses add up. In addition, I mean, these visas are limited in number. I mean, if you're just looking for agricultural workers, there's only about 66,000 agricultural temporary visas. So every year, employers have to apply for temporary visas. And there's some industries like dairy that need workers all year. So that system doesn't work for them. So we need an immigration system that's modern, that's efficient, that's based not just on family, but also on the need of the US economy.
Mhm. Juan Carlos, you're incredibly smart. So I take it you probably did not watch that much television growing up, but I did. And there was this big trope on these 90s sitcoms. And I'm utterly convinced that this is why people think immigration is so easy, where someone would just get married and that would like solve the entire like immigration dilemma. Like this happened on like literally every 90s show, like as you go Friends, like Will and Grace, like it was just this big trope. So I have like this like belief that that poisoned the minds of so many people into thinking that it's just like a, oh, just get married and then there you
Yeah, you'd be surprised. I mean, honestly, even if you're married to a US citizen, it's still very difficult because of certain rules in immigration law that bar people who, for some reason or another, made the mistake of coming in and across the US multiple times, or, for example, accidentally saying they were a US citizen when they were in fact not. So those types of bars even prevent people who are married to U.S. citizens from being able to get green cards. There was one recent story actually of a DACA recipient teacher who graduated from Texas A&M, had a master's degree, married to a U.S. citizen who had to travel to Ciudad Juarez in Mexico for a green card interview. And when she tried to come back into the U.S., she was denied because she had multiple reentries. So they actually had to ask for a special humanitarian visa so that she could come and be back with her little daughter. So that's just another example of just how punitive immigration law can be. The intent of the law should be to keep families together and not separated.
Yeah. Oh, well, that story again highlights the need that we have right now to actually get something passed. So I know we are waiting to hear from that Senate parliamentarian, but what do you hope, happens in the next couple of days, weeks, months that we can maybe expect?
Yeah, absolutely. So, phase one of this cycle in Congress of passing budget reconciliation will include the parliamentarian making a judgment on whether immigration can be included. And if it doesn't work out that this category of 7 million immigrant workers can be included, there's other options that have been reported in the media, including something called registry, which would mean that immigrants just have to register with the government if they came before a certain date, which is of right now. In the 1970s, you had to have come before then in order to be able to register with the government and be eligible for a green card. So that's another possibility, is to move the date up so that more people are able to get in line, so to speak, to get a green card. And long term, I mean, we're looking at a population of immigrants that honestly, many of them are growing older, and the US population is also aging. We're seeing shortages in healthcare, in home care, and this is something that should be worrying for everybody, because who's going to take care of our parents, of ourselves when we get old? So we need a smart and efficient immigration system that reflects the demographic reality, which is the country is now more diverse than ever, and that we need avenues for people from all over the world to come here and to contribute to our country. So that's what I'm looking at to in the next couple of years, is how do we create a system that is more responsive to our economic needs.
Mhm. And in the short term, we also have a midterm election, as you did mention. So, in addition to all the things that we pay attention to where people stand on immigration reform.
Yeah, immigration in 2022 is one of those things that will divide people. It's one thing that we're seeing politicians use to attract and to play to their base. I mean, just this morning reported that Congresswoman Elise Stefanik from New York is basically arguing that if you provide legal status for immigrants, that you're basically going to allow these people to only vote for Democrats, which is, it's totally not true, because immigrants can, many of them vote for Democrats and Republican. Like you mentioned, when the last legalization happened in the 80s under Ronald Reagan, many of those immigrants ended up becoming Republican voters. So really, it shouldn't be a question of which, it should be a winning issue for both Republicans and Democrats. Whoever is able to provide legal status for immigrant workers will be rewarded at the ballot box.
Mhm. I actually went to college with Elise. She's very different than when I knew her, but that's all I'll say on that matter. Well, again, Juan Carlos, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for walking us through this very convoluted topic. But we will be keeping an eye on this. And again, my thanks to everyone for listening to this episode of the TexMix. Be sure to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at TexMix Podcast. You can follow us on Google, Spotify, Apple. I believe we're now also on Amazon. And we'll catch you later, y'all.
Thank you so much.